Chapter 17. As might be expected, the Beowulfers finished their hypership first. They had started with everything but a little know-how, which had been quickly learned. Amaterasu had had to begin by creating the industry they needed to create the industry they needed to build a ship. The Beowulf ship, she was named Viking's Gift, came in on Tanith 5.5 years after the Nemesis and the Space Scourge had raided Beowulf. Her skipper had fought a normal drive ship in that battle. Beside plutonium and radioactive isotopes, she carried a general cargo of the sort of luxury goods unique to Beowulf, which could always find a market in interstellar trade. After selling the cargo and depositing the money in the Bank of Tanith, the skipper of the Viking's Gift wanted to know where he could find a good planet to raid. They gave him a list, none too tough, but all slightly above the chicken-stealing level, and another list of planets he was not to raid, planets with which Tanith was trading. 6 months later, they learned that he had showed up on Capera, with which they were now trading, and had flooded the market there with plundered textiles, hardware, ceramics, and plastics. He had bought crag meat and hides. "You see what you did now?" Harkiman clamored. "You thought you were making a customer. What you made was a competitor." "What I made was an ally. If we ever do find Dunnan's planet, we'll need a fleet to take it. A couple of Beowulf ships would help. You know them. You fought them too." Harkiman had other worries. While cruising in Coruscant 2, he had come in on Vithar, one of the planets where Tanith ships traded, to find it being raided by a space Viking ship based on Sochi. He had fought a short but furious ship action, battering the invader until he was glad to hyper out. Then he had gone directly to Sochi, arriving on the heels of the ship he had beaten, and had had it out both with the captain and the Prince Victor, serving them with an ultimatum to leave Tanith trade planets alone in the future. "How did they take it?" Trask asked when he returned to report. "Just about the way you would have. Victor said his people were space Vikings, not Gilgameshers. I told him we weren't Gilgameshers either, as he'd find out on Sochi the next time one of his ships raided one of our planets. Are you going to back me up? Of course, you can always send Prince Victor my head and an apology." "If I have to send him anything, I'll send him a sky full of ships and a planet full of hellburners. You did perfectly right, Otto. Exactly what I'd have done in your place." There the matter rested. There were no more raids by Sochi ships on any of their trade planets. No mention of the incident was made in any of the reports sent back to Graham. The Graham situation was deteriorating rapidly enough. Finally, there was an audio-visual message from Angus himself. He was seated on his throne, wearing his crown, and began speaking from the screen abruptly. "We, Angus, King of Graham and Tanith, are highly displeased with our subject Lucas, Prince and Viceroy of Tanith. We consider ourselves very badly served by Prince Trask. We therefore command him to return to Graham and render to us account of his administration of our colony and realm of Tanith." After some hasty preparations, Trask recorded a reply. He was sitting on a throne himself, and he wore a crown just as ornate as King Angus, and robes of white and black Himotep furs. "We, Lucas, Prince of Tanith," he began, "are quite willing to acknowledge the suzerainty of the King of Graham, formerly Duke of Wardshaven. It is our earnest desire, if possible, to remain at peace and friendship with the King of Graham, and to carry on trade relations with him and with his subjects. We must, however, reject absolutely any efforts on his part to dictate the internal policies of our realm of Tanith. It is our earnest hope—" damn it, he'd said earnest. He should have thought of some other word. "That no act on the part of His Majesty the King of Graham will create any breach in the friendship existing between his realm and ours." 3 months later, the next ship, which had left Graham while King Angus' summons was still in hyperspace, brought Baron Rathmore. Shaking hands with him as he left the landing craft, Trask wanted to know if he'd been sent out as the new viceroy. Rathmore started to laugh and ended by cursing vilely. "No, I've come out to offer my sword to the King of Tanith," he said. "Prince of Tanith, for the time being," Trask corrected. "The sword, however, is most acceptable. I take it you had all of our blessed sovereign you can stomach?" "Lucas, you have enough ships and men here to take Graham," Rathmore said. "Proclaim yourself King of Tanith, and then lay claim to the throne of Graham, and the whole planet would rise for you." Rathmore had lowered his voice, but even so, the open landing stage was no place for this sort of talk. He said so, ordered a couple of the locals to collect Rathmore's luggage, and got him into a hall car, taking him down to his living quarters. After they were in private, Rathmore began again. It's more than anybody can stand. There isn't one of the old great nobility he hasn't alienated, or one of the minor barons, the landholders and industrialists, the people who are always the backbone of Graham. And it goes from them down to the common folk. Assessments on the lords, taxes on the people, inflation to meet the taxes, high prices, debased coinage. Everybody's being beggared except this rabble of new lords he has around him, and that slut of a wife and her greedy kinsfolk. Trask stiffened. You're not speaking of Queen Flavia, are you? He asked softly. Rathmore's mouth opened slightly. Great Satan, don't you know? No, of course not. The news would have come on the same ship I did. Why, Angus divorced Flavia. He claimed that she was incapable of giving him an heir to the throne. He remarried immediately. The girl's name meant nothing to Trask. He did know of her father, a Baron Valdiva. He was lord of a small estate south of the Ward lands and west of New Haven. Most of his people were out-and-out bandits and cattle rustlers, and he was as close to being one himself as he could get. Nice family he's married into, a credit to the dignity of the throne. Yes, you wouldn't know this Lady Demoiselle Evita. She was only 17 when you left Graham, and hadn't begun to acquire a reputation outside her father's lands. She's made up for lost time since, though, and she has enough uncles and aunts and cousins and ex-lovers and what-not to fill out an infantry regiment, and every one of them's at court with both hands out to grab everything they can. How does Duke Joris like this? The Duke of Biglersport was Queen Flavia's brother. I dare say he's less than delighted. He's hiring mercenaries is what he's doing, and buying combat contragravity. Lucas, why don't you come back? You have no idea what a reputation you have on Graham now. Everybody would rally to you. He shook his head. I have a throne here on Tanith. On Graham, I want nothing. I'm sorry for the way Angus turned out. I thought he'd make a good king. But since he's made an intolerable king, the lords and people of Graham will have to get rid of him for themselves. I have my own tasks here. Rathmore shrugged. I was afraid that would be it, he said. Well, I offered my sword, and I won't take it back. I can help you in what you're doing on Tanith. The captain of the Free Space Viking Damn Thing was named Roger van Morville Esterson, which meant that he was some sword worlder's acknowledged bastard by a woman of one of the old Federation planets. His mother's people could have been Nergalers. He had coarse black hair, a mahogany-brown skin, and red-brown, almost maroon eyes. He tasted the wine the robot poured for him and expressed appreciation, then began unwrapping the parcel he had brought in. Something I found while reading on Tetragrammaton, he said. I thought you might like to have it. It was made on Graham. It was an automatic pistol with a belt and holster. The leather was bisonoid hide. The buckle of the belt was an oval enameled with a crescent, pale blue on black. The pistol was a plain 10mm military model with grooved plastic grips. On the receiver it bore the stamp of the House of Hoylbar, the firearms manufacturers of Glaspith. Evidently it was one of the arms Duke Omfrey had provided for Andre Dunnan's original mercenary company. Tetragrammaton? He glanced over the big board. There was no previous report from that planet. How long ago? I'd say about 300 hours. I came from there directly, less than 250 hours. Dunnan's ships had left the planet 3 days before I got there. That was practically sizzling hot. Well, sooner or later, something like that had to happen. The Space Viking was asking him if he knew what sort of a place Tetragrammaton was. Neo-barbarian, trying to civilize in a crude way. Small population, concentrated on one continent, farming and fisheries. A little heavy industry in a small way at a couple of towns. They had some nuclear power, introduced a century or so ago by traders from Marduk, one of the really civilized planets. They still depended on Marduk for fissionables. Their export product was an abominably smelling vegetable oil which furnished the base for delicate perfumes, and which nobody was ever able to synthesize properly. I heard they had steel mills in operation now, the half-breed Space Viking said. It seems that somebody on Rimon has just reinvented the railroad, and they need more steel than they can produce for themselves. I thought I'd raid Tetragrammaton for steel and trade it on Rimon for a load of heaven tea. When I got there, though, the whole planet was in a mess. Not raiding, but plain wanton destruction. The locals were just digging themselves out of it when I landed. Some of them, who didn't think they had anything at all left to lose, gave me a fight. I captured a few of them to find out what had happened. One of them had that pistol. He said he'd taken it off a space Viking he'd killed. The ships that raided them were the Enterprise and the Yo-Yo. I knew you'd want to hear about it. I got some of the local stories on tape. Well, thank you. I'll want to hear those tapes. Now, you say you want steel? Well, I haven't any money. That's why I was going to raid Tetragrammaton. Niflheim with the money. Your cargo's paid for already. This, he said, touching the pistol, and whatever's on the tapes. They played off the tapes that evening. They weren't particularly informative. The locals who had been interrogated hadn't been in actual contact with Dunnan's people except in combat. The man who had been carrying the 10mm Hoyle bar was the best witness of the lot, and he knew little. He had caught one of them alone, shot him from behind with a shotgun, taken his pistol, and then gotten away as quickly as he could. They had sent down landing craft, it seemed, and said they wanted to trade. Then something must have happened. Nobody knew what, and they had begun a massacre and sacked the town. After returning to their ships, they had opened fire with nuclear missiles. Sounds like Dunnan, Hugh Rathmore said in disgust. He just went kill-crazy. The bad blood of Blackcliff. There are funny things about this, Rogue Valkenane said. I'd say it was a terror raid, but who in Gehenna was he trying to terrorize? I wondered about that too, Archiman frowned. This town where he landed seems, such as it was, to have been the planetary capital. They just landed, pretending friendship, which I can't see why they needed to pretend, and then they began looting and massacring. There wasn't anything of real value there. All they took was what the men could carry themselves or stuff into their landing craft, and they did that because they have what amounts to a religious taboo against landing anywhere and leaving anything without stealing something. The real loot was at these two other towns, a steel mill and big stocks of steel at one, and all that skunk apple oil at the other. So what did they do? They dropped a 5-megaton bomb on each one and blew both of them to MC Square. That was a terror raid pure and simple, but as Boak inquires, just who were they terrorizing? If there were big cities somewhere else on the planet, it would figure, but there aren't. They blew out the two biggest cities and all the loot in them. Then they wanted to terrorize somebody off the planet. But nobody'd hear about it off-planet, somebody protested. The Mardukans would. They trade with Tetragrammaton. The acknowledged bastard of the somebody named Morville said. They have a couple of ships a year there. That's right, Trask agreed. Marduk. You mean you think Dunnan's trying to terrorize Marduk? Valkenane demanded. Great Satan, even he isn't crazy enough for that. Baron Rathmore started to say something about what Andre Dunnan was crazy enough to do, and what his uncle was crazy enough to do. It was just one of the cracks he had been making since he'd come to Tanith, and didn't have to look over his shoulder while he was making them. I think he is too, Trask said. I think that is exactly what he's doing. Don't ask me why. As Otto was fond of remarking, he's crazy and we aren't, and that gives him an advantage. But what have we gotten since those Gilgameshers told us about his picking up Burik's ship and the Honest Horse? Until today, we've heard nothing from any other space Viking. What we have gotten was stories from Gilgameshers about raids on planets where they trade, and every one of them is also a planet where Marduk ships trade. And in every case, there's been little or nothing reported about valuable loot taken. The stories are all about wanton and murderous bombings. I think Andre Dunnan is making war on Marduk. And he's crazier than his grandfather and his uncle both, Rathmore cried. You mean he's making a string of terror raids on their trade planets, hoping to pull the Mardukan space navy away from the home planet? Harkonnen had stopped being incredulous. And when he gets them all lured away, he'll make a fast raid? That's what I think. Remember, our fundamental postulate, Dunnan is crazy. Remember how he convinced himself that he was the rightful heir to the ducal crown of Wardshaven? And remember his insane passion for Elaine? He pushed that thought hastily from him. Now he's convinced that he's the greatest space Viking in history. He has to do something worthy of that distinction. When was the last time anybody attacked a civilized planet? I don't mean Gilgamesh. I mean a planet like Marduk. 120 years ago, Prince Havelgar on Halticlear, 6 ships against Aton. 2 ships got back. He didn't. Nobody's tried it since, Harkonnen said. So Dunnan the Great will do it. I hope he tries, he surprised himself by adding. That's provided I find out what happened. Then I could stop thinking about him. There was a time when he had dreaded the possibility that somebody else might kill Dunnan before he could. End of Chapter 17. Chapter 18. Seashat, Obidakut, Lugaluru, Audhomla. The young man elevated by his father's death in the Dunnan raid to the post of hereditary president of the Democratic Republic of Tetragrammaton had been sure that the Marduk ships which came to his planet traded also on those. There had been some difficulty about making contact, and the first face-to-face meeting had begun in an atmosphere of bitter distrust on his part. They had met out of doors. Around them spread wrecked and burning buildings, and hastily constructed huts and shelters, and wide spaces of charred and slagged rubble. They blew up the steel mill here, and the oil refinery at Jansboro. They bombed and strafed the little farm towns and villages. They scattered radioactives that killed as many as the bombing, and after they'd gone away, this other ship came. The damn thing? She bore the head of a beast with 3 very big horns. That's the one. They did a little damage at first. When the captain found out what had happened to us, he left some food and medicines for us. Roger Van Morvel Esterson hadn't mentioned that. Well, we'd like to help you, if we can. Do you have nuclear power? We can give you a little equipment. Just remember it of us when you're back on your feet. We'll go back to trade later. But don't think you owe us anything. The man who did this to you is my enemy. Now I want to talk to every one of your people who can tell me anything at all. Seashat was the closest. They went there first. They were too late. Seashat had had it already, and on the evidence of the radioactivity counters, not too long ago. 400 hours at most. There had been 2 hellburners. The cities on which they had fallen were still smoking pits, literally burned into the ground and the bedrock below, at the center of 500-mile radii of slag and lava and scorched earth and burned forests. There had been a planet buster. It had started a major earthquake and half a dozen thermonuclears. There were probably quite a few survivors. A human planetary population is extremely hard to exterminate completely, but within a century they'd be back to the loincloth and the stone hatchet. We don't even know Dunnan did it personally, Patrick Moreland said. For all we know, he's down in an airtight cave city on some planet nobody ever heard of, sitting on a golden throne, surrounded by harem. He had begun to suspect that Dunnan was doing something of just the sort. The greatest space Viking of history would naturally found a space Viking empire. An emperor goes out to look his empire over now and then. I don't spend all my time on Tanith. Say we try out Homla next. It's the farthest away. We might get there while he's still shooting up Obidakut and Lugaru. Got? Figure us a jump for it. When the colored turbulence washed away and the screen cleared, Audhomla looked like Tanith or Capera or Amaterasu or any other Terra-type planet, a big disk brilliant with reflected sunlight and glowing with starlit and moonlit atmosphere on the other. There was a single rather large moon, and on the telescopic screen the usual markings of seas and continents and rivers and mountain ranges. But there was nothing to show. Oh, yes, lights on the darkened side, and from the size they must be vast cities. All the available data for Audhomla was long out of date. A considerable civilization must have developed in the last half-dozen centuries. Another light appeared, a hard blue-white spark that spread into a larger, less brilliant yellow light. At the same time, all the alarm devices in the command room went into a pandemonium of jangling and flashing and squawking and howling and shouting. Radiation, energy release, contragravity distortion effects, infrared output, a welter of indecipherable radio and communication screen signals, radar and scanner ray beams from the planet. Trask's fists began hurting. He found that he'd been pounding the desk in front of him with it. He stopped it. We got him. "We caught him!" he was yelling hoarsely. "Full speed and continuous acceleration as much as we can stand. We'll worry about decelerating when we're in shooting distance." The planet grew steadily larger. Carford was taking him at his word about continuous acceleration. There'd be a Gehenna of a bill to pay when they started decelerating. On the planet, more bombs were going off just outside atmosphere beyond the sunset line. "Ship observed. Altitude about 100 to 500 miles. Hundreds, not thousands. 35 degrees north latitude, 50 degrees west of the sunset line. Ship is under fire. Bomb explosions near her," a voice whooped. Somebody else was yelling that the city lights were really burning cities, or burning forests. The first voice, having stopped, broke in again. "Ship is visible in telescopic screen, just to the sunset line. There's another ship detected, but not visible, somewhere around the equator, and a third one somewhere out of sight. We can just get the fringe of her contragravity field around the planet." That meant there were two sides in a fight, unless Dunnan had picked up a third ship somewhere. The telescopic view shifted for a moment. The planet was completely off-screen, and then its curvature came into the screen against a star-scattered background. They were almost into 2,000 miles now. Carford was yelling to stop acceleration and trying to put the ship into a spiral orbit. Suddenly, they caught a glimpse of one of the ships. "She's in trouble." That was Paul Korof's voice. "She's leaking air and water vapor like crazy." "Well, is she a good guy or a bad guy?" Moreland was yelling back, as though Korof's spectroscopes could distinguish. Korof ignored that. "Another ship making signal," he said. "She's the one coming up over the equator. Sword World Impulse code, her communication screen combination, and an identify yourself." Carford punched out the combination as Korof finished it. While Trask was desperately willing his face into immobility, the screen lighted. It wasn't Andre Dunnan. That was a disappointment. It was almost as good, though, his henchman, Sir Neville Orme. "Well, Sir Neville, a pleasant surprise," he heard himself saying. "We last met on the terrace at Carvel House, did we not?" For once, the paper-white face of Andre Dunnan's âme damnée showed expression. But whether it was fear, surprise, shock, hatred, anger, or what combination of them, Trask could no more than guess. "Trask! Satan curse you!" Then the screen went blank. In the telescopic screen, the other ship came on unfalteringly. Paul Korof, who had gotten more data on mass, engine energy output, and dimensions, was identifying her as the Enterprise. "Well, go for her. Give her everything." They didn't need the order. Van Larch was speaking rapidly into his handphone, and Alvin Carford was hurling his voice all over the Nemesis, warning of sudden deceleration and direction change. And while he was speaking, things in the command room began sliding. In the telescopic screen, the other ship was plainly visible. He could see the oval patch of black with the blue crescent, and in his screen Dunnan would be seeing the sword-impaled skull of the Nemesis. If only he could be sure Dunnan was there to see it. If it had only been Dunnan's face instead of Orme's that he had seen in the screen. As it was, he couldn't be sure, and if one of the missiles that was already going out made a lucky hit, he might never be sure. He didn't care who killed Dunnan or how. All he wanted was to know that Dunnan's death had set him free from a self-assumed obligation that was now meaningless to him. The Enterprise launched countermissiles. So did the Nemesis. There were momentarily unbearable flashes of pure energy, and from them globes of incandescence spread and vanished. Something must have gotten through. Red lights flashed on the damage board. It had been something heavy enough to jolt the huge mass of the Nemesis. At the same time, the other ship took a hit from something that would have vaporized her had she not been armored in collapsium. Then, as they passed close together, guns hammered back and forth along with missiles, and then the Enterprise was out of sight around the horizon. Another ship, the size of Otto Harkeman's Coruscant II, was approaching. She bore a tapering, red-nailed feminine hand dangling a planet by a string. They rushed toward each other, planting a garden of evanescent fire-flowers between them. They pounded one another with guns, and then they sped apart. At the same time, Paul Korof was picking up an impulse code signal from the third, crippled ship. A screen combination. Trask punched it out as he received it. A man in space armor was looking out of the screen. That was bad, if they had to suit up at the command room. They still had air. His helmet was off, but it was attached and hinged back. On his breastplate was the device of a dragon-like beast perched with its tail around a planet and a crown above. He had a thin, high-cheeked face with a vertical wrinkle between his eyes and a clipped blonde mustache. "Who are you, stranger? You're fighting my enemies. Does that make you a friend?" "I'm a friend of anybody who owns Andre Dunnan as enemy. Sword World Nemesis. I'm Prince Lucas Trask of Tanith, commanding." "Royal Mardukan ship Victrix." The thin-faced man gave a wry laugh. "Not been living up to her name so well. I'm Prince Simon Bentrick, commanding." "Are you still battle-worthy?" "We can fire about half our guns. We still have a few missiles left. 70% of the ship sealed off, and we've been holed at a dozen places. We have power enough for lift and some steering way. We can't make lateral way except at the expense of lift," which made the Victrix practically a stationary target. He yelled over his shoulder at Carford to cut speed all he could without tearing things apart. "When that cripple comes into view, start circling around her. Get into a tight circle above her." He turned back to the man on the screen. "If we can get ourselves slowed down enough, we'll do all we can to cover you." "All you can is all you can. Thank you, Prince Trask." "Here comes the Enterprise," Carford shouted, with obscenely blasphemous embellishments. "She hairpinned on us." "Well, do something about her." Van Larch was already doing it. The Enterprise had taken damage in the last exchange. A corps of spectroscopes showed her haloed with air and water vapor. Her instruments would be getting the same story from the Nemesis. Wedge-shaped segments extending 6 to 8 decks in were sealed off in several places. Then the only thing that could be seen with certainty was the blaze of mutually destroying missiles between. The short-range gun duel began and ended as they passed. In the screen, he had seen a fat, round-nosed thing come up from the Victrix, curving far out ahead of the passing Enterprise. She was almost out of sight around the planet when she ran head-on into it, and vanished in an awesome blaze. For a moment, he thought she had been destroyed. Then she lurched into sight and went around the curvature of Alhomla. Trask and the Mardukan were shaking hands with themselves at each other in their screens. Everybody in the Nemesis command room was screaming, "Well shot, Victrix, well shot." Then the yo-yo was coming around again, and Van Larch was saying, "Gehenna with this fooling around. I'll fix the expurgated unprintability." He yelled orders. A jumble of code letters and numbers, and things began going out. Most of them blew up in space. Then the yo-yo blew up. Very quietly, as things do where there is no air to carry shock and sound waves, but very brilliantly. There was brief daylight all over the night side of the planet. "That was our planet buster," Larch said. "I don't know what we'll use on Dunnan." "I didn't know we had one," Trask admitted. "Otto had a couple built on Beowulf. The Beowulfers are good nuclear weaponeers." The Enterprise came back hastily to see what had blown up. Larch put off another entertainment of small stuff with a 50-megaton thermonuclear, view screen piloted among them. It had its own arsenal of small missiles, and it got through. In the telescopic screen, a jagged hole was visible just below the equator of the Enterprise, the edges curling outward. Something, possibly a heavy missile in an open tube ready for launching, had gone off inside her. What the inside of the ship was like, or how many of her company were still alive, was hard to guess. There were some, and her launchers were still spewing out missiles. They were intercepted and blew up. The whole of the Enterprise bulked huge in the guidance screen of the missile and filled it. The jagged crater that obliterated the bottom of Dunnan's blue crescent blazon spread to fill the whole screen. The screen went milky white as the pickup went off. All the other screens blazed briefly until their filters went on. Even afterward they glared like the cloud-veiled sun of Graham at high noon. Finally, when the light intensity had dropped and the filters went off, there was nothing left of the Enterprise but an orange haze. Somebody, Patrick, Baron Moreland, he saw, was pounding him on the back and screaming inarticulately at his ear. A dozen space-armored officers with planet-perched dragons on their breast were crowding beside Prince Bentrick in the screen from the Victrix, whooping like drunken bison herders on payday night. "I wonder," he said, almost inaudibly, "if I'll ever know if Andre Dunnan was on that ship." End of Chapter 18. Chapter 19. Prince Trask of Tanith and Prince Simon Bentrick were dining together on an upper terrace of what had originally been the mansion house of a Federation-period plantation. It had been a number of other things since. Now it was the municipal building of a town that had grown around it, which had, somehow, escaped undamaged from the Dunnan Blitz. Normally about 5 or 10,000, the place was now jammed with almost 50,000 homeless refugees from half a dozen other towns that had been destroyed, overflowing the buildings and crowding into a sprawling camp of hastily built huts and shelters. And already permanent buildings were going up to accommodate them. Everybody, locals, Marduckans, and space Vikings, had been busy with the work of relief and reconstruction. This was the first meal the two commanders had been able to share in any leisure at all. Prince Bentrick's enjoyment of it was somewhat impaired by the fact that from where he sat, he could see, in the distance, the sphere of his disabled ship. "I doubt we can get her off planet again, let alone into hyperspace." "Well, we'll get you and your crew to Marduk and the Nemesis then." They were both speaking loudly, above the clank and clatter of machinery below. "I hope you didn't think I'd leave you stranded here." "I don't know how either of us will be received. Space Vikings haven't been exactly popular on Marduk lately. They may thank you for bringing me back to Stantral," Bentrick said bitterly. "I'd have anybody shot who let his ship get caught as I did mine. Those two were down in atmosphere before I knew they'd come out of hyperspace." "I think they were down on the planet before your ship arrived." "Oh, that's ridiculous, Prince Trask," the Mardukan cried. "You can't hide a ship on the planet. Not from the kind of instruments we have in the Royal Navy." "We have pretty fair detection ourselves," Trask reminded him. "There's one place where you can do it, at the bottom of an ocean with 1,000 or so feet of water over her. That's where I was going to hide the Nemesis if I got here ahead of Dunnan." Prince Bentrick's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. He lowered it slowly to his plate. That was a theory he'd like to accept, if he could. But the locals, they didn't know about it. They wouldn't. They have no off-planet detection of their own. Come in directly over the ocean, out of the sun, and nobody'd see the ship. "Is that a regular space Viking trick?" "No. I invented it myself on the way from Seashat. But if Dunnan wanted to ambush your ship, he'd have thought of it too. It's the only practical way to do it." Dunnan, or Neville Orm, he wished he knew, and was afraid he would go on wishing all his life. Bentrick started to pick up his fork again, changed his mind, and sipped from his wine glass instead. "You may find you're quite welcome on Marduk at that. These raids have only been a serious problem in the last 4 years. I believe, as you do, that this enemy of yours is responsible for all of them. We have half the Royal Navy out now, patrolling our trade planets. Even if he wasn't on board the Enterprise when you blew her up, you put a name on him, and can tell us a good deal about him." He set down the wine glass. "Why, if it weren't so utterly ridiculous, one might even think he was making war on Marduk." From Trask's viewpoint, it wasn't ridiculous at all. He merely mentioned that Andre Dunnan was psychotic, and let it go at that. The Victrix was not completely unrepairable, although quite beyond the resources at hand. A fully equipped engineer ship from Marduk could patch her hull and replace her Dillinghams and her Abbott lift and drive engines, and make her temporarily space-worthy until she could be gotten to a shipyard. They concentrated on repairing the Nemesis, and in another 2 weeks she was ready for the voyage. The 600-hour trip to Marduk passed pleasantly enough. The Mardukan officers were good company, and found their space Viking opposite numbers equally so. The two crews had become used to working together on Andhomla, and mingled amicably off watch, interesting themselves in each other's hobbies and listening avidly to tales of each other's home planets. The space Vikings were surprised and disappointed at the somewhat lower intellectual level of the Mardukans. They couldn't understand that. Marduk was supposed to be a civilized planet, wasn't it? The Mardukans were just as surprised, and inclined to be resentful, that the space Vikings all acted and talked like officers. Hearing of it, Prince Bentrick was also puzzled. Forecastle hands on a Mardukan ship belonged definitely to the lower orders. "There's still too much free land and free opportunity on the Sword Worlds," Trask explained. "Nobody does much bowing and scraping to the class above him. He's too busy trying to shove himself up into it. And the men who ship out as space Vikings are the least class-conscious of the lot. Think my men may have trouble on Marduk about that. They're all insist on doing their own drinking in the swankiest places in town. No, I don't think so. Everybody will be so amazed that space Vikings aren't 12 feet tall, with 3 horns like a Zarathustra damn thing and a spiked tail like a Fafnir manticore, that they won't even notice anything less. Might do some good in the long run. Crown Prince Edward will like your space Vikings. He is much opposed to class distinctions and caste prejudices. Says they have to be eliminated before we can make democracy really work. The Mardukans talked a lot about democracy. They thought well of it. Their government was a representative democracy. It was also a hereditary monarchy, if that made any kind of sense. Trask's efforts to explain the political and social structure of the Swords worlds meant the same incomprehension from Bentrick. Why, it sounds like feudalism to me. That's right. That's what it is. A king owes his position to the support of his great nobles. They owe theirs to their barons and landholding knights. They owe theirs to the people. There are limits beyond which none of them can go. After that, their vassals turn on them. Well, suppose the people of some barony rebel. Won't the king send troops to support the baron? What troops? Outside a personal guard and enough men to police the royal city and hold the crown lands, the king has no troops. If he wants troops, he has to get them from his great nobles. They have to get them from their vassal barons, who raise them by calling out their people. That was another source of dissatisfaction with King Angus of Graham. He had been augmenting his forces by hiring off-planet mercenaries. And the people won't help some other baron oppress his people. It might be their turn next. You mean the people are armed? Prince Bentrick was incredulous. Great Satan, aren't yours? Prince Trask was equally surprised. Then your democracy's a farce, and the people are only free on sufferance. If their ballots aren't secured by arms, they're worthless. Who has the arms on your planet? Why, the government. You mean the king? Prince Bentrick was shocked. Certainly not. Horrid idea. That would be... Why, it would be despotism. Besides, the king wasn't the government at all. The government ruled in the king's name. There was the Assembly, the Chamber of Representatives, and the Chamber of Delegates. The people elected the representatives, and the representatives elected the delegates, and the delegates elected the chancellor. Then there was the prime minister. He was appointed by the king, but the king had to appoint him from the party holding the most seats in the Chamber of Representatives, and he appointed the ministers, who handled the executive work of the government. Only their subordinates in the different ministries were career officials, who were selected by competitive examination from the bottom jobs and promoted up the bureaucratic ladder from there. This left Trask wondering if the Mardukan Constitution hadn't been devised by Goldberg, the legendary old Terran inventor who had always done everything the hard way. It also left him wondering just how in Gehenna the government of Marduk ever got anything done. Maybe it didn't. Maybe that was what saved Marduk from having a real despotism. Well, what prevents the government from enslaving the people? The people can't. You just told me that they aren't armed, and the government is. He continued, pausing now and then for breath, to catalogue every tyranny he had ever heard of, from those practiced by the Terran Federation before the Big War, to those practiced at Eglindsby on Amaterasu by Pedro and Pedro. A few of the very mildest were pushing the nobles and people of Graham to revolt against Angus I. And in the end, he finished, the government would be the only property owner and the only employer on the planet, and everybody else would be slaves, working at assigned tasks, wearing government-issued clothing, and eating government food, their children educated as the government prescribes, and trained for jobs selected for them by the government, never reading a book, or seeing a play, or thinking a thought that the government had not approved. Most of the Mardukans were laughing now. Some of them were accusing him of being just too utterly ridiculous. Why, the people are the government. The people would not legislate themselves into slavery. He wished Otto Harkonnen were there. All he knew of history was the little he had gotten from reading some of Harkonnen's books, and the long, rambling conversations aboard ship in hyperspace or in the evenings at Rivington. But Harkonnen, he was sure, could have furnished hundreds of instances on scores of planets in over 10 centuries of time in which people had done exactly that, and hadn't known what they were doing, even after it was too late. They have something about like that on Aton, one of the Mardukan officers said. Oh, Aton, that's a dictatorship, pure and simple. That planetary nationalist gang got into control 50 years ago during the crisis after the war with Baldur. They were voted into power by the people, weren't they? Yes, they were, Prince Bentrick said gravely. It was an emergency measure, and they were given emergency powers. Once they were in, they made the emergency permanent. It couldn't happen on Marduk, a young nobleman declared. It could if Zaspar McCann's party wins control of the assembly at the next election, somebody else said. Oh, then Marduk's safe. The sun will go nova first, one of the junior Royal Navy officers said. After that, they began talking about women, a subject any spaceman will drop any other subject to discuss. Trask made a mental note of the name of Zaspar McCann, and took occasion to bring it up in conversation with his shipboard guests. Every time he talked about a McCann to 2 or more Mardukans, he heard at least 3 or more opinions about the man. He was a political demagogue. On that, everybody agreed. After that, opinions diverged. McCann was a raving lunatic, and all the followers he had were a handful of lunatics like him. He might be a lunatic, but he had a dangerously large following. Well, not so large. Maybe they'd pick up a seat or so in the assembly, but that was doubtful. Not enough of them in any representative district to elect an assemblyman. He was just a smart crook, milking a lot of half-witted plebeians for all he could get out of them. Not just plebes, either. A lot of industrialists were secretly financing him in hope that he would help them break up the labor unions. You're nuts. Everybody knew the labor unions were backing him, hoping he'd scare the employers into granting concessions. You're both nuts. He was backed by the mercantile interests. They were hoping he'd run the Gilgameshers off the planet. Well, that was one thing you had to give him credit for. He wanted to run out the Gilgameshers. Everybody was in favor of that. Now Trask could remember something he'd gotten from Harkonnen. There had been Hitler, back at the end of the 1st century pre-atomic. Hadn't he gotten into power because everybody was in favor of running out the Christians or the Muslims or the Albigensians or somebody? End of chapter 19. Chapter 20. Marduk had 3 moons, a big one 1,500 miles in diameter, and 2 insignificant 20-mile chunks of rock. The big one was fortified, and a couple of ships were in orbit around it. The Nemesis was challenged as she emerged from her last hyperjump. Both ships broke orbit and came out to meet her, and several more were detected lifting away from the planet. Prince Bentrick took the communication screen and immediately encountered difficulties. The Commandant, even after the situation had been explained twice to him, couldn't understand. A Royal Navy fleet unit knocked out in a battle with Space Vikings was bad enough, but being rescued and brought to Marduk by another Space Viking simply didn't make sense. He then screened the royal palace at Malverton on the planet. First, he was icily polite to somebody several echelons below him in the peerage, and then respectfully polite to somebody he addressed as Prince Vandervant. Finally, after some minutes' wait, a frail, white-haired man in a little black cap of maintenance appeared in the screen. Prince Bentrick instantly sprang to his feet. So did all the other Mardukans in the command room. Your Majesty, I am most deeply honored. Are you all right, Simon? The old gentleman asked solicitously. They haven't done anything to you, have they? Saved my life, and my men's, and treated me like a friend and a comrade, Your Majesty. Have I your permission to present, informally, their commander, Prince Trask of Tanith? Indeed you may, Simon. I owe the gentleman my deepest thanks. His Majesty, Mikhail VIII, Planetary King of Marduk, Prince Bentrick said. His Highness, Lucas, Prince Trask, Planetary Viceroy of Tanith for His Majesty Angus the First of Graham. The elderly monarch bowed his head slightly. Trask bowed a little more deeply from the waist. I am very happy, Prince Trask. First, I confess, at the safe return of my kinsman, Prince Bentrick, and then at the honor of meeting one in the confidence of my fellow sovereign, King Angus of Graham. I will never be ungrateful for what you did for my cousin and for his officers and men. You must stay at the palace while you are on this planet. I am giving orders for your reception, and I wish you to be formally presented to me this evening. He hesitated briefly. Graham. That is one of the sword worlds, is it not? Another brief hesitation. Are you really a space Viking, Prince Trask? Maybe he'd expected space Vikings to have 3 horns and a spiked tail and stand 12 feet tall himself. It took several hours for the Nemesis to get into orbit. Bentrick spent most of them in a screen booth and emerged visibly relieved. Nobody's going to be sticky about what happened on Alhomla, he told Trask. There will be a board of inquiry. I'm afraid I had to mix you up in that. It's not only about the action on Alhomla. Everybody from the space minister down wants to hear what you know about this fellow Dunnan. Like yourself, we all hope he went to MC Square along with his flagship, but we can't take it for granted. We have over a dozen trade planets to protect, and he's hit more than half of them already. The process of getting into orbit took them around the planet several times, and it was a more impressive spectacle at each circuit. Of course, Marduk had a population of almost 2 billion and had been civilized with no hiatus of neo-barbarism since it had first been colonized in the 4th century. Even so, the space Vikings were amazed and stubbornly refusing to show it at what they saw in the telescopic screens. Look at that city, Patrick Morland whispered. We talk about the civilized planets, but I never realized they were anything like this. Why, this makes Excalibur look like Tanith. The city was Malverton, the capital. Like any city of a contragravity-using people, it lay in a rough circle of buildings towering out of green interspaces, surrounded by the smaller circles of spaceports and industrial suburbs. The difference was that any of these were as large as Camelot on Excalibur, or 4 Wardshavens on Graham, and Malverton itself was almost half the size of the whole barony of Traskin. They aren't any more civilized than we are, Patrick. There are just more of them. If there were 2 billion people on Graham, which I hope there never will be, Graham would have cities like this too. One thing, the government of a planet like Marduk would have to be something more elaborate than the loose feudalism of the Sword Worlds. Maybe this Goldbergocracy of theirs had been forced upon them by the sheer complexity of the population and its problems. Alvin Carford took a quick look around him to make sure none of the Mardukans were in earshot. I don't care how many people they have, he said. Marduk can be had. A wolf never cares how many sheep there are in a flock. With 20 ships, we could take this planet like we took Eglindsby. There'd be losses coming in, sure, but after we were in and down, we'd have it. Where would we get 20 ships? Tanith at a pinch could muster 5 or 6, counting the free space Vikings who used the base facilities. They would have to leave a couple to hold the planet. Beowulf had 1, and another almost completed, and now there was an Amaterasu ship. But to assemble a space Viking armada of 20, he shook his head. The real reason why space Vikings had never raided a civilized planet successfully had always been their inability to combine under one command in sufficient strength. Besides, he didn't want to raid Marduk. A raid, if successful, would yield immense treasures, but cause 100, even 1,000 times as much destruction, and he didn't want to destroy anything civilized. The landing stages of the palace were crowded when he and Prince Bentrick landed, and at a discreet distance, swarms of air vehicles circled, creating a control problem for the police. Parting from Bentrick, he was escorted to the suite prepared for him. It was luxurious in the extreme, but scarcely above Sword World standards. There were a surprising number of human servants, groveling and fawning and getting underfoot, and doing work robots could have been doing better. What robots there were inefficient, and much work and ingenuity had been lavished on efforts to copy human form to the detriment of function. After getting rid of most of the superfluous servants, he put on a screen and began sampling the newscasts. There were telescopic views of the Nemesis from some craft on orbit nearby, and he watched the officers and men of the Victrix being disembarked. There were other views of their landing at some naval installation on the ground, and he could see reporters being chevied away by Navy ground police, and there was a wide range of commentary opinion. The government had already denied that 1. Prince Bentrick had captured the Nemesis and brought her in as a prize, and 2. The Space Vikings had captured Prince Bentrick and were holding him for ransom. Beyond that, the government was trying to sit on the whole story, and the opposition was hinting darkly at corrupt deals and sinister plots. Prince Bentrick arrived in the midst of an impassioned tirade against pusillanimous traitors surrounding His Majesty who were betraying Marduk to the Space Vikings. "Why doesn't your government publish the facts and put a stop to that nonsense?" Trask asked. "Oh, let them rave," Bentrick replied. "The longer the government waits, the more they'll be ridiculed when the facts are published. Or the more people will be convinced the government had something to hush up and had to take time to construct a plausible story." He kept the thought to himself. It was their government. How they mismanaged it was their own business. He found that there was no bartending robot. He had to have a human servant bring drinks. He made up his mind to have a few of the Nemesis robots sent down to him. The formal presentation would be in the evening. There would be a dinner first, and because Trask had not yet been formally presented, he couldn't dine with the king. But because he was, or claimed to be, Viceroy of Tanith, he ranked as the chief of state and would dine with the Crown Prince, to whom there would be an informal introduction first. This took place in a small antechamber off the banquet hall. The Crown Prince and Crown Princess and Princess Bentrick were there when they arrived. The Crown Prince was a man of middle age, graying at the temples, with the glassy stare that betrayed contact lenses. The resemblance between him and his father was apparent. Both had the same studious and impractical expression, and might have been professors on the same university faculty. He shook hands with Trask, assuring him of the gratitude of the court and royal family. "You know, Simon is next in succession after myself and my little daughter," he said. "That's too close to take chances with him." He turned to Bentrick. "I'm afraid this is your last space adventure, Simon. You'll have to be a spaceport spaceman from now on." "I shan't be sorry," Princess Bentrick said. "And if anybody owes Prince Trask gratitude, I do." She pressed his hands warmly. "Prince Trask, my son wants to meet you. Very badly. He's 10 years old, and he thinks Space Vikings are romantic heroes." "He should be one for a while. He should just see a planet Space Vikings had raided." Most of the people at the upper end of the table were diplomats, ambassadors from Odin and Baldur and Isis and Ishtar and Aton and the other civilized worlds. No doubt they hadn't actually expected horns and a spiked tail, or even tattooing and a nose ring. But after all, Space Vikings were just some sort of neo-barbarians, weren't they? On the other hand, they had all seen views and gotten descriptions of the Nemesis, and had heard about the ship action on Adhomla, and this Prince Trask. A Space Viking prince, that sounded civilized enough, had saved a life with only 3 other lives, one almost at an end, between it and the throne. And they had heard about the screen conversation with King McKill. So they were courteous through the meal and tried to get as close as possible to him in the procession to the throne room. King McKill wore a golden crown topped by the planetary emblem, which must have weighed twice as much as a combat helmet, and fur-edged robes that would weigh more than a suit of space armor. They weren't nearly as ornate, though, as the regalia of King Angus I of Graham. He rose to clasp Prince Bentrick's hand, calling him "dear cousin," and congratulating him on his gallant fight and fortunate escape. That knocks any court-martial talk on the head, Trask thought. He remained standing to shake hands with Trask, calling him "valued friend to me and my house." First person singular. That must be causing some lifted eyebrows. Then the king sat down, and the rest of the roomful filed up onto the dais to be received, and finally it was over, and the king rose and proceeded, followed by his immediate suite between the bowing and curtsying court and out the wide doors. After a decent interval, Crown Prince Edvard escorted him and Prince Bentrick down the same route, the others falling in behind, and across the hall to the ballroom, where there was soft music and refreshments. It wasn't too unlike a court reception on Excalibur, except that the drinks and canapes were being dispensed by human servants. He was wondering what sort of court functions Angus the First of Graham was holding by now. Another half an hour, a posse of court functionaries approached and informed him that it had pleased His Majesty to command Prince Trask to attend him in his private chambers. There was an audible gasp at this. Both Prince Bentrick and the Crown Prince were trying not to grin too broadly. Evidently this didn't happen too often. He followed the functionaries from the ballroom, and the eyes on everybody else followed him. Old King McKill received him alone in a small, comfortably shabby room behind vast ones of incredible splendor. He wore fur-lined slippers and a loose robe with a fur collar, and his little black cap of maintenance. He was standing when Trask entered. When the guards closed the door and left him alone, he beckoned Trask to a couple of chairs with a low table, on which were decanters and glasses and cigars between. "It's a presumption on royal authority to summon you from the ballroom," he began, after they had seated themselves and filled the glasses. "You are quite a cynosure, you know." "I'm grateful to your Majesty. It's both comfortable and quiet here, and I can sit down." Your Majesty was the center of attention in the throne room, yet I seemed to detect a look of relief as you left it. "I try to hide it as much as possible." The old king took off the little gold-circled cap and hung it on the back of his chair. "Majesty can be rather wearying, you know." So he could come here and put it off. Trask felt that some gesture should be made on his own part. He unfastened the dress dagger from his belt and laid it on the table. The king nodded. "Now we can be a couple of honest tradesmen. Our shop's closed for the evening, relaxing over our wine and tobacco," he said. "Eh, Goodman Lucas?" It seemed like an initiation into a secret society whose ritual he must guess at step by step. "Right, Goodman McKill." They lifted their glasses to each other and drank. Goodman McKill offered cigars, and Goodman Lucas held a light for him. "I hear a few hard things about your trade, Goodman Lucas." "All true, and mostly understated. We're professional murderers and robbers, as one of my fellow tradesmen says. The worst of it is that robbery and murder become just that, a trade, like servicing robots or selling groceries." "Yet you fought 2 other space Vikings to cover my cousin's crippled victories. Why?" So he must tell his tale, so worn and smooth, again. King McKill's cigar went out while he listened. "And you have been hunting him ever since? And now you can't be sure whether you killed him or not?" "I'm afraid I didn't. The man on the screen is the only man Dunham can really trust. One or the other would stay wherever he has his base all the time." "And when you do kill him, what then?" "I'll go on trying to make a civilized planet of Tanith. Sooner or later I'll have one quarrel too many with King Angus, and then we will be our Majesty Lucas the First of Tanith, and we will sit on a throne and receive our subjects. And I'll be glad when I can get my crown off and talk to a few men who call me shipmate instead of your Majesty." "Well, it would violate professional ethics for me to advise a subject to renounce his sovereign, of course, but that might be an excellent thing. You met the ambassador from Ithavoll at dinner, did you not? 3 centuries ago, Ithavoll was a colony of Marduk. It seems we can't afford colonies anymore, and it seceded from us. Ithavoll was on a planet like your Tanith seems to be. Today it is a civilized world, and one of Marduk's best friends. You know, sometimes I think a few lights are coming on again, here and there in the old Federation. If so, you space Vikings are helping to light them." "You mean the planets we use as bases, and the things we teach the locals?" "That too, of course. Civilization needs civilized technologies, but they have to be used for civilized ends. Do you know anything about a space Viking raid on Aton over a century ago?" 6 ships from Hull to clear, 4 destroyed. The other 2 returned damaged and without booty. The king of Marduk nodded. That raid saved civilization on Aton. There were 4 great nations. The 2 greatest were at the brink of war, and the others were waiting to pounce on the exhausted victor, and then fight each other for the spoils. The Space Vikings forced them to unite. Out of that temporary alliance came the League for Common Defense, and from that the Planetary Republic. The Republic's a dictatorship now, and just between Goodman McKill and Goodman Lucas, it's a nasty one, and Our Majesty's government doesn't like it at all. It will be smashed, sooner or later, but they'll never go back to divided sovereignty and nationalism again. The Space Vikings frightened them out of that when the dangers inherent in it couldn't. Maybe this man Dunnan will do the same for us on Marduk. You have troubles? You've seen these civilized planets. How does it happen? I know how it's happened on a good many. War, destruction of cities and industries, survivors among ruins, too busy keeping their own bodies alive to try to keep civilization alive. Then they lose all knowledge of how to be civilized. That's catastrophic decivilization. There is also decivilization by erosion, and while it's going on, nobody notices it. Everybody is proud of their civilization, their wealth and culture, but trade is falling off. Fewer ships come in each year, so there is boastful talk about planetary self-sufficiency. Who needs off-planet trade anyhow? Everybody seems to have money, but the government is always broke. Deficit spending, and always the vital social services for which the government has to spend money. The most vital one, of course, is buying votes to keep the government in power, and it gets harder for the government to get anything done. The soldiers are sloppier at drill, and their uniforms and weapons aren't taken care of. The non-coms are insolent, and more parts of the city are dangerous at night, and then even in the daytime, and it's been years since a new building went up, and the old ones aren't being repaired anymore. Trask closed his eyes. Again he could feel the mellow sun of Graham on his back, and hear the laughing voices on the lower terrace, and he was talking to Lothar Fail and Rovard Groffus and Alex Gorham and Cousin Nicolay and Otto Harkonnen, he said. And finally, nobody bothers fixing anything up, and the power reactors stop, and nobody seems to be able to get them started again. It hasn't gotten quite that far in the Sword Worlds yet. It hasn't here either. Yet. Goodman McKill slipped away. King McKill VIII looked across the low table at his guest. Prince Trask, have you heard of a man named Zaspar McCann? Occasionally. Nothing good about him. He is the most dangerous man on this planet, the king said, and I can make nobody believe it. Not even my son. End of chapter 20.